That's the point that I'm making, which is like the way that Americans think, like liberalism to its highest extent, is that's what they think. When the average American, when they think of like who is a leftist or what is a leftist, like that is what they perceive as leftism. All right, let's watch why the far right is always worse than the far left.
Extremism as being equally evil and dangerous. This is commonly referred to as horseshoe theory. If you follow both left or right-wing ideology to their extremes, they eventually become equivalent to one another. This is wrong for a variety of historical and ideological reasons. In today's video, we're going to take left-wing ideology and right-wing ideology, drag them out to their extremes in both personal characteristics and government policies, and show how right-wing extremism is more...
Why do you feel the need to always run defense for regimes/people simply because they're seen as left? I don't have any... Wait, what? I don't have any... I don't think North Korea is leftist, chatter. What the... I think North Korea is a victim. That's it. I understand that when countries are pummeled into the ground by much more powerful superpowers for political gain or geopolitical strategy, that they are understandably going to develop resentment, be infinitely more sheltered, and also behave in dictatorial ways, authoritarian ways. I don't think that North Korea is closer to a monarchy than it is a robust leftist democracy. It's so weird. All of this, I'm reminded, all of this started because I said, I don't give a fuck about North Korea. They got nothing. They got no motion. Poor guys.
Morally worse and a much bigger threat. Let's first establish general left versus right values, starting with the left. The left is broadly progressive. The left believes in caring for all and uplifting the poor. They believe in limiting the power of moneyed interests and corporations, and most importantly, view politics through material conditions. This means how much money people have and their access to housing, food, healthcare, employment, and technology. These material conditions are seen as the biggest determiner in how a society functions. Violence, poverty...
I mean, you know nothing about North Korea? Invite an expert on North Korea. Your explanations are confusing. Yeah, I need to get Yami Park in here right now. Pronto. What does she have to say? That's right. In North Korea, green card holders get kidnapped for practicing their First Amendment. I think it's because you said I have no problem with North Korea. Yeah, it's true. I don't. What do you mean? Like, if you spend any time, if you live in the United States of America and you spend more than 3.5 seconds in your life thinking about how dangerous North Korea is, you are a moron. Okay? Sorry. That's just, I don't make the rules except for that one. I just made that rule up. You are a rube, a mark, a sucker. They have not the GDP of like Mississippi, but instead the GDP of like a town in Mississippi. And you're out here being like, no, they're a part of this scary coalition force that is actively trying to undermine America and the Western world. Like they got nothing. We f***ed them over. It's all dust. It's all rubble. Okay, that's it. We will never address the crimes that we engaged in Korea. Oh. Anyway, let's continue.
And general social dynamics are at their core influenced by material conditions above all else. The left believes in wealth redistribution and a strong central state that can provide infrastructure and meet the basic needs of all people. The left believes in strong social safety nets and making sure that people in weaker positions, like the old, disabled, and minority groups, should be uplifted. They lastly value internationalism and solidarity amongst the global working class. Now let's take a look at right-wing values. The right is conservative, praising tradition over progressive ways of thinking. The right typically opposes political and social reform. Being inherently opposed to progressivism and new ideas, the role they play is often an oppositional reaction to social and economic reforms proposed by the left, hence the term describing them reactionary. The right typically values past traditions and usually wants to return to a time in the past where the society supposedly had better values and was more prosperous. The right believes in natural hierarchies. There are always winners and losers, and the human condition cannot overcome these natural ways of living. Hard work and morality are the biggest determiners in your place in society. Right-wingers believe that the conditions of society, like poverty, social dynamics, and crime, are not the result of people's material conditions. Poverty and crime are a reflection of personal and moral failures. They therefore believe in equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. Oftentimes, this hierarchy is tied to nationalism, race, or religion. They prefer a smaller government but large military and value national interest. Now let's briefly touch on the center. The center wants to maintain the status quo. The center in modern times is reflected in what many often refer to as
Why did North Korea end up the way it is, whereas Cuba made so much better progress in fields like medicine? Easy answer. North Korea's reliance on the USSR was far more significant than Cuba. Cuba, out of proximity, was very far away. And also, Cuba had a successful revolution. North Korea, as a nation state, was invented through genocide. Like, that's it. Cuba had a successful revolution. It's not like North Korea was like, oh yeah, we're having our own revolution. It was more so that like the popular figures at the time, led by Kim Il-sung, were pushed into the North, and that the initial war heroes were slowly cast aside by the American military and the ridiculous leadership that they planted. Also, even Cuba is struggling. It's not like they're doing great. Also, North Korea had a massive famine too after the USSR's dissolution.
as neoliberal politics. They do not believe or want to fundamentally change the economic system. They believe in free markets and much less constrained capitalism. Liberals do not believe in a hierarchical society as conservatives do. They speak to underprivileged groups, but largely don't believe in or are not willing to enact radical economic programs or reforms. Instead of
U.S. Air Force commander, over a period of 3 years or so, we killed off, 20% of the population of Korea as direct casualties of war or starvation or exposure. DPRK is my academic focus. I link great accessible videos I hope you will consider watching. Mega, Yami, and North Korea. What is this?
Which went on.
What is this? North Korea has a worse embargo than Iraq before the 2003 war, dude. I don't even know how the they've been functioning. It's so sad. They've been basically a arm of China for the most part. That's how they've been functioning. China is their entry point into the global market.
focusing on funding social services, safety nets, and universal programs like the left, liberals prefer information campaigns and a media culture war to uplift underprivileged groups. Liberals and centrism love procedures and rules. They love trying to work with Republicans even when they're actively spitting in their face. Centrists often create programs to help minority groups, but many only focus on improving visibility and representation. Their vision of success is getting diverse people into the top jobs in the same oppressive structures in government or corporations, dominating the communities they come from. From a left-wing view, centrism ignores the root causes of inequality by avoiding big reforms like universal healthcare, raising the minimum wage, addressing policing, or wealth inequality. They see progress as just selecting a more diverse ruling class. From a right-wing view, centrism is seen as giving special treatment when everyone is supposedly starting on equal ground. This, coupled with liberals' desire to maintain the obviously failing status quo, and elitism, frustrates both sides, which is why people on the left and the right hate liberals. Many people in the United States confuse liberals with the left when liberals are very much not leftists. Many self-proclaimed liberals in the US only call themselves liberals because of mainstream media framing. Liberalism is presented as the only alternative to conservatism or the Republican Party. In reality, when you ask them about key policy issues, like cutting the military budget, legalizing marijuana, free college, universal healthcare, canceling student debt, and medical debt, their views are far to the left of the Democratic Party and liberalism. The center/liberals believe that the current system is broken, we just need to make a couple tweaks to fix it. Never anything too fundamental. While the left believes that the system is not broken, but working exactly as intended. Capitalism will naturally create the problems we are seeing in society. The left does not want to fix the current system, but dismantle it and create a different system. So in reality, there are a lot of people in the US who may claim to be liberals, but are actually leftists. Now that we have a very condensed idea of left, right, and center, let's take these ideologies to the extreme and show which ideology is more dangerous. The criteria we are using to judge the morality of each extreme is which ideology gives the best outcomes to pursue happiness, peace, and enrichment for a majority of society. First, let's talk about your average right-wing conservative. As a moderate conservative, you believe in hierarchy. You see winners and losers in society, but you think it's based on merit. People get what they deserve by working hard or making good choices. Maybe your family struggled in the past, but they pulled through by working hard and doing everything the right way. And now you're looking around and wondering why other people can't do the same. To you, things like poverty or crime aren't about systemic issues. They're excuses. You're tired of hearing about handouts when you and your family didn't need them. You wouldn't call yourself a racist at all. You might have minority friends you genuinely like. Maybe you work or grew up with some. You respect the ones you know personally, the ones who work hard and do it the right way. But when you look at the larger picture, it's harder to feel the same way. You see the news or scroll online, and it's full of stories about crime, drugs, or poverty in minority communities. It starts to feel like those things aren't just individual problems, but tied to cultures or communities. And politically, you're frustrated. You've seen your town go downhill over the years, jobs disappeared, industries left, and everything has gotten more expensive. Democrats or liberals in power didn't fix any of that. If anything, things got worse. You miss the days when your community had better paying jobs and people seemed to have stronger values. You like someone like Trump because he sticks it to those liberal elites who are completely out of touch with normal people like you. You're not extreme though. You might laugh at an edgy joke here and there, but you don't see yourself as one of those far-right types. Their open racism or fascism is a step too far for you. Now let's take those baseline right-wing beliefs to the extreme. Let's look at the far right. Maybe your town was pretty homogenous, or maybe the only minorities you saw were poor and struggling. You probably had someone in your life, like an uncle, parent, or cousin, who was openly bigoted and planted those ideas in you early on. Once you started getting online, the stuff you saw there backed up what you already thought. It's not that some people aren't working hard, it's because they can't. They're not making bad decisions because of bad luck or tough circumstances, they're making those decisions because they're inferior. And you start going deeper into those ideas. It's their genetics, their culture, their religion. All of it is supposedly worse than yours. Poverty and crime aren't because of material conditions or any system. It's because those people are naturally like that. And now it's not just their problem, it's society's problem. They're the reason for crime, poverty, and everything else that's wrong with the world. They're taking your jobs, they're ruining your country. The solution, according to these extremists, is to get rid of them. Whether it's controlling birth rates, forcing them out, or outright violence, the goal is a pure society. If they don't do something now, there'll be more of them than us, and that can't happen. At first, it's just online talk. You find some message board full of people who feel the same way, and you start hanging out there. Maybe you even show up to a protest in real life, covering your face, of course, to complain about a mosque being built or something. But here's the important thing. This ideology always ends in violence. That's the final step. It's terrorism directed at the outgroup. The mass shootings in New Zealand, New York, Texas, there are countless examples of where this goes. Those shooters didn't act in a vacuum. They wrote manifestos, and guess what was on them? The same far-right talking points you'll find on those message boards. This type of targeted violence is almost exclusively right-wing. On a personal level, far-right extremists are some of the most isolated, miserable people you'll ever meet. Most of them are losers. They've got maybe one or two friends in real life, and they're constantly trying to outdo each other in how extreme they can get. The rest of their social life is online, hanging out in echo chambers with racists and incels. There are two main types of these guys. First, you've got the more socially awkward ones. They're bitter, jaded, and insecure. They don't share their views confidently in real life, so they stick to dark humor or mumble it under their breath. Online, they're very loud. Then you've got the Proud Boy types. These people need to play up their masculinity and 1950s-ass idea of male values. Unsurprisingly, the people who want to play up their masculinity are also deeply insecure and cowardly. They love playing pretend cowboy and dedicating their life to hating others. They channel their insecurities into the most pathetic form of community imaginable and a fake form of ethnic white unity. Truly, some of the biggest losers in the world. To live this lifestyle is corrosive to the core, and these are deeply sad, miserable people. That was the personal journey of extremism. But it doesn't take a genius to guess what the results are when far-right extremism captures a country's government. Let's look at some far-right governments. Taking baseline conservative instincts of hierarchy and in-and-out groups to their extreme has dire consequences. Conservatism is inherently dividing. The degree of how far on the right translates to how far you crack down on the people you think are different from you. As a result, far-right extremism results in brutal attacks on perceived outgroups. Employing the power of the state, its media, and industry against targeted groups.
I wonder what country he's gonna shout out here.
Leads to oppression, apartheid, or extermination. A majority of the worst atrocities you can think of in the past 150 years or so can be tied directly to this ideology. In Spain, Francisco Franco's fascist forces carried out mass executions.
This is a really good video. Holy shit, dude. This guy's got 232 subs. Big homie, I'm here because of Hassan Piker is very slowly watching your video. Glad to have you found you. Thanks for your hard work.
Suppressed languages and cultures, and killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and political prisoners. In Central America, Nicaragua, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras all experienced right-wing.
Link it? I wonder if it's linked. I wonder if it's a video that we linked on the top of the chat. I'm thinking if there's a link, it probably would be pinned, right? On the top of the chat. Oh, that's right. It is there. Why do chatters always do this? You literally will. No, because you never link anything. No, because you never see it. It's always linked. Literally, always. It is always linked. The video that we're reacting to is always linked to the chat. The problem is you don't see it And then you just assume that it's not linked. It's linked every time.
Paramilitary operations. These were trained and funded by the US to overthrow popular, democratically elected socialist governments. These paramilitaries committed widespread atrocities, massacring civilians to ensure the governments remained loyal to US interests. Combined, these actions resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. In fascist Italy, Benito Mussolini embraced an extreme right-wing ideology rooted in ultranationalism, militarism, and the subjugation of perceived inferior groups. Mussolini's government orchestrated the mass murder of political opponents and marginalized groups through internment camps. During wars of expansion in Ethiopia and Libya, fascist forces used chemical weapons, razed villages, and imprisoned civilians in brutal conditions. In Chile, socialist leader Salvador Allende was overthrown in a US-backed coup, leading to Augusto Pinochet's brutal regime. Pinochet's government tortured, killed, and disappeared tens of thousands of people. In the United States, the Ku Klux Klan terrorized and killed tens of thousands in a campaign of racist violence and terrorism. Japanese fascism, often overlooked in these discussions, justified its atrocities with a belief of ethnic and cultural superiority. This ideology led to an estimated tens of millions of deaths across Asia. In China alone, Japanese forces directly killed 10 to 25 million people and indirectly caused the deaths of up to 50 million through starvation and other means, all the while committing some of the most depraved atrocities imaginable, such as human experiments and the infamous rape of Nanking. The most infamous example, of course, is Nazi Germany, which industrialized mass murder to an unprecedented degree, resulting in an estimated 15 million deaths. You could go on for much longer, touching on the far-right extremism and fascism in places like Indonesia, Greece, Portugal, and so on. These examples underscore the devastating consequences of right-wing extremism when it captures state power. Whether targeting groups based on ethnicity, religion, race, or ideology, the result has consistently been terror and mass killings. These are just some of the most infamous instances. Okay, now let's take your average left-wing person. If you're left-wing, you've got at least a basic understanding of capitalism and how it is tied to poverty, homelessness, and crime. When you see someone struggling, your instinct isn't to judge them or feel disappointed in their actions. You're asking, what can society do to help them? And empathy is in front and center in your worldview. You'll point out the flaws in the capitalist system, but you're not about to overthrow the whole thing. You're skeptical of revolution, but looking for big changes, and you think we can get there without tearing everything down. You still believe in the current institutions, and maybe you're imagining something like social democracies in Europe, especially those in Scandinavia with stronger social safety nets and fairness baked into society. Look at how popular Bernie Sanders was in 2016 and 2020. That's the kind of left we're talking about here. You're not necessarily diving into Marxist or revolutionary ideas, you're focused on making changes happen within the system as it stands. Now let's take those baseline left-wing ideas to the extreme. They're just as empathetic as your average leftist, but you're a lot more direct and critical about calling out capitalism as the root of the problem. For you, it's not about fixing the system, but overthrowing it. Capitalism isn't just flawed, it's the crux of the problem. And if that means violent revolution, you're ready for it. In fact, most believe that violent revolution might be the only way to remove the ruling class. You probably participate in or organize labor unions, political parties, or activist groups. You're uncompromising in your beliefs, and you have no patience for fascists or racists.
Max left.
Similar to the far right, your ideology can sometimes make you stand out or even feel isolated in mainstream social settings. You might be more out there in terms of appearance with tattoos, piercings, or clothing. Far left groups are typically diverse, and there really isn't an out group. Everyone is generally accepted except for the far right. When it comes to violence, far left extremists have much different targets and philosophy compared to the far right. They're not out targeting random civilians or marginalized groups. They're going after fascists or the state. Antifa is the common boogeyman and is painted as the worst of leftist extremism, the left's version of a school shooter. Unless you are a fascist or a Nazi, which we can all hopefully agree are universally bad ideologies, you have nothing to fear. Their violence is directed towards fascists so that they can never feel comfortable enough to march openly and attack minority groups. The media would like you to believe horseshoe theory that Antifa violently defending minorities is the equivalent of a mass shooter going into a grocery store and indiscriminately killing minorities. The left extremist goal is an objectively more admirable goal than wholesale massacre.
Shameless.
Despite what media might say, far left violence is almost always directed at specific targets, not innocent random people. The Center for Strategic and International Studies in 2020 revealed that over the previous 25 years, the vast majority of terrorist attacks and plots in the US were perpetrated by far-right attackers. 90% of all terrorism in 2020 alone was right-wing. Of the remaining leftist terrorist attacks, there were acts like assaults, firebombings, and arson. Even environmental protesters sitting on roads or treetops were often registered as acts of terrorism. Actual targeted attacks on individuals with deadly violence from a leftist is exceedingly rare. The most recent prominent case being Luigi Mangione. I'll let you decide for yourself if that violent act is the equivalent to a right-wing person targeting a random black person or immigrant in a grocery store. I'm not saying you cannot find examples of left-wing extremists killing innocent people, but looking at targets and frequency, it's not even a question of which is worse. Meanwhile, we have constant right-wing attacks year after year to the point where it's a fairly common occurrence. Now, I know what many people associate with the far left, especially Americans, is identity politics. While the far right is fairly universal in their messaging, the far left tends to splinter, particularly with messaging around identity. While all leftists want what's best for everyone in marginalized groups, there can be a large difference in the messaging and way to achieve that. There are broadly two camps. The first method focuses on universality, meaning focusing on uniting everyone on an equal field and speaking to every group at the same level. There may be specific groups that are struggling more, but the best way to help them is by focusing on raising all working.
I got into it with someone about the horseshoe theory recently. I tried explaining that prejudice against trans people and vulnerable groups is not the same as prejudice against the wealthy and Nazis, but genuinely told me that they are the same thing. Being a Nazi or being wealthy is not an inalienable characteristic. They're immutable. It's just something you can't change about yourself. You're just born trans, you are trans. You're black, you are black. Also, yeah, the horseshoe theory is completely made up. That's the other thing. It's just not like a real valid it's not like a real valid political theory.
Working class people's standards together. Hyper-focusing on specific identities only divides the working class and alienates people who would have otherwise been on board with the class struggle. It drives their attention away from class politics to focusing on their racial, gender, and identity differences. In the modern day, this method of messaging is typically divided between Eastern and Western leftists. The former Soviet Union and currently Communist China does not participate in any type of identity politics messaging that you would be familiar with in the West, focusing much more on universalism amongst class. Modern Western leftists tend to focus much more on individual identities and develop specific messaging campaigns and terminology. They attempt the impossible task of trying to accommodate catered messaging to every possible difference between different groups, usually to the dissatisfaction of every group. While this is certainly done in good faith and by well-intentioned people on the left, the alienation that this is done on the working class is undeniable.
The rules specify that when we have a gender non-binary candidate or officer, the non-binary individual is counted as neither male nor female, and the remaining 6 offices must be gender balanced. With the results of the previous 4 elections, our elected officers are currently 2 male and 2 female. In order to be gender balanced, we must elect 1 male, 1 female, and 1 person of any gender.
New wave academic terminology, discourse, and aggressive messaging around marginalized groups can be off-putting and not very accessible for your average working class person. Western leftists have placed themselves on a tightrope between messaging on universal programs that benefit everyone, while at the same time not wanting to figuratively or...
I think radical liberalism of that sort that seeks to actively undermine solidarity is just unhelpful, unproductive. It doesn't mean that you should just like drop. It doesn't mean you should drop allyship over social causes. But yeah, it's just, I don't think that those guys are like extreme leftists in general. I think they're just silly people who desperately cling on to any sort of radical politics they can that still somehow fits within the neat confines of permissible politics. You can be as radical as you want when it comes to, like, I don't know, gender-related things, as long as you're not undermining the pre-established hierarchy. Bro, that was at the DNC election. There's nothing radical there. No, I know it's not, but that's why I'm saying that it might come across as a radical ideology. But that radical, why are you scared? I'm not. I don't know what you mean by that. But that's precisely my point. To the average American, that conversation is seen as like the most radical, most extreme leftist position you can have. And yet it's at the DNC. Do you see what I mean? That's the point that I'm making, which is like the way that Americans think, like liberalism to its highest extent, is that's what they think. When the average American, when they think of like who is a leftist or what is a leftist, like that is what they perceive as leftism.
Literally abandon specific groups. This has undoubtedly contributed to the failure of the left in the West. The right wing capitalizes on this weakness by using working class people's annoyance with identity politics to vote completely against their best interests and focus on the culture war. Now let's get to the far left government. Before we get into discussing the far left government, please take a second to subscribe and like the video. Thank you. Let's look at what happens when these far left beliefs are
Okay, this dude is definitely a Hasanabi head. I'm sorry. That right there is some shit I would do.
held in positions of power. The left's main targets are those who are perpetuating
This video sucks. I don't think this video sucks at all.
systems of inequality, capitalists, wealthy elites, and landlords. Unlike the far right, where violence is directed downward onto marginalized outgroups, far left violence is directed upward to those in positions of power. The left's targets are a very small, highly powerful elite and fascists, in stark contrast to the far right's focus on much larger portions of the population, entire ethnicities, religions, immigrants, or those with different sexual orientations. It is undeniably more just to challenge those exploiting others than to persecute individuals based on inherent traits or identity. Far-right governments seek to reinforce or expand existing hierarchies through policies of apartheid, genocide, or ethnic cleansing. Left-wing governments, even when authoritarian, aim to eradicate feudal systems, redistribute land, and eliminate poverty. These goals are intended to benefit the majority, even if they fail in execution. After addressing the atrocities of far-right regimes, it's essential to confront the darker chapters of far-left governments as well. One significant group of victims under far-left regimes have been those perceived as traitors or counter-revolutionaries. These victims, most notably during Stalin's purges, the Cultural Revolution, and the Khmer Rouge genocide, were casualties of paranoia, authoritarianism, and internal power struggles. Undoubtedly, many, if not most of the victims were loyal communists or innocent
Fair.
swept up in the chaos.
I don't think
However,
it's unfair.
it is crucial to separate these actions from the core tenets of leftist ideology. Nowhere in Marx's works does it advocate for purges, paranoia, or suppression of intellectuals. These killings were products of authoritarianism and power struggles, not intrinsic to leftist ideology. This is a fundamental difference between the far left and far right. These are traits that can manifest in any regime, right-wing or left-wing. To act like these are exclusively communist or left-wing traits is absurd. Right-wing regimes have employed the same methods to suppress dissent and consolidate power. Also,
Way more frequently. And way more brutally. And also not with a like a higher purpose of distribution in mind or development in mind.
not all leftist governance is authoritarian. Many democratic socialist systems, such as those in Nordic countries, demonstrate how leftist principles can also exist without authoritarianism. And not all far-left authoritarianism is bad, as we have seen with the success of China raising 800 million people from poverty through what they call a dictatorship of the working class. When examining Western death tolls attributed to leftist governments, many deaths, such as those caused by famines in Maoist China, are ridiculously attributed to communism itself. Poor policies in some instances maybe, but it is an insane assertion to present starvation as a core feature of communism, especially considering famines were a rampant recurring tragedy in pre-communist China and Russia with non-existent help from any government. Also, estimates of these death tolls are heavily inflated for Western narratives. The same death tolls, no joke, also count the deaths of Nazis killed by the Red Army during World War II in their victims of communism body count. In contrast, the tangible improvements brought about by leftist revolutions cannot be ignored. In the Soviet Union, Cuba, and China, literacy rates doubled, life expectancy rose dramatically, urbanization and industrialization surged, and infant mortality plummeted. These achievements outpaced progress in the capitalist West, which took centuries to reach the same milestones. If famines under communism are to be criticized, then the systematic poverty, starvation, and neglect perpetuated under capitalism, particularly in Africa and the global South, must also be criticized. The resources exist to eradicate extreme poverty worldwide, but under capitalism, the profit motive is more important over human welfare. Communist China, for instance, has not only eliminated abject poverty, but is bringing the global South with it through its Belt and Road Initiative. Meanwhile, capitalist countries are controlled by oligarchs and face rising poverty rates and rapidly declining living standards. Blaming communism for starvation and suffering ignores the mass suffering under feudalism, monarchy, and capitalism, which is never examined. If you take left-wing ideology to its extreme, it means doing the best for the majority of the underprivileged by any means necessary. The bad things that happen are in the context of implementing a noble aspiration of a just and equal society. Taking the right to the extreme always results in the subjugation, othering, and usually destruction of whole populations of people. Maybe you're off-put by extremism in general and think of yourself more as a moderate. You want to pick a side and fall somewhere in the middle. I think it's better to choose the side that's end aspiration is a classless, stateless utopia, compared to an ethnically homogenous, divided world amongst nation-states built on hierarchies. Taking baseline conservative views and extending them must lead to an outgroup, a scapegoat, and inferior.
It also doesn't address the underlying problems. I've talked about this before. Like, let's take the Pareto principle, right? Something that incels used to talk about all the time. Incels on their own personal journey to becoming like right-wing, reactionary, white nationalist weirdos oftentimes start as people who believe and abide by the Pareto principle, where, you know, the top 20% of guys, all of 80% of the women, right? So what's interesting about that is that a lot of these people will look to that. A lot of these incels would look to that and go, oh, but if we have, like, you know, a white nationalist, more traditional society, then we will get laid as well. Not realizing that a white nationalist society does not change the underlying problem. It doesn't address it at all. It would be the top 20% of Aryan dickheads that would be having sex with 80% of the Olgas and Helgas in a white nationalist society. Your ass, as an incel, would still not be getting pussy in the white nationalist dystopia that you envision for yourself. Okay? That's it. Whereas a left-wing ideology or left-wing attitudes, extreme leftists, max leftists, do genuinely seek to undermine pre-existing forms of power, pre-existing hierarchies, with the ultimate purpose of greater redistributive policies. Okay?
How far you go on the right spectrum is the degree of intensity in which you hate or attack a certain group, starting at personal bias and bigotry as a moderate to death and extermination at its furthest. Meanwhile, your targets on the left are not everyday people, it's the small populations of oligarchs or fascists. Their removal also isn't necessarily death, as many on the left believe in rehabilitation and re-education. When communism took over in China in 1949, the last emperor of China from its dynasty-based government system was still in the country. Instead of killing him, Mao just educated him on communism and gave him a normal-ass job. You should never feel threatened by a far-left person. Unless you are an open racist or Nazi, which I hope you shouldn't feel concerned for, then you are within the 99% of people who are not a target. In personal relationships, it should be universally clear which side of the spectrum's extremists you would rather deal with. For one, leftists seldomly commit acts of terrorism. When they do violent acts, it's often targeted at corporations or government infrastructure, like vandalizing weapon plants, sending arms to apartheid states. They never intentionally target innocent civilians. Far-right people are jaded, antisocial, violent, openly misogynistic, and racist. They are insecure and full of hatred. They are inherently dangerous and nihilistic. Identity politics and left messaging can be cringe and annoying, but like, what's worse? There's a good Stavros joke about this that I can't remember exactly, but it goes something like, the left extremist person at worst might look strange to you, have a weird hair color, and be annoying. At least they want what's best for you, and they're definitely not going to hurt you. I'll take that any day of the week over some guy with an AR-15. The nature of the human condition is cooperation and progress, not division and hierarchies created on a superficial basis. Thank you guys for watching. Please subscribe and let me know what you think in the comments, whether you agree.
Yeah, this was great. Let's see how many subs you got
Left
since
and
we
right
started
extremism
watching.
as being
Damn,
equally evil
almost
and
2K subs. Let's go. Good shit. This video very clearly looks this from the left. Yeah, of course. Yeah, this was a yes. But I don't think it would be effective video in converting people in the middle as well as it will be seen as partisan. Yeah, I don't really care. I liked it. He's apolitical. Look at the thumbnail. You put me there with Mao and a faceless Antifa guy. Right-wing ideology only makes sense if we consider white supremacy as its foundation. It's one of the most coherent, most consistent forms of right-wing ideology. So yes, I agree. There should be less content friendly to centrists. I'm convinced all centrist content is what keeps centrists comfortable sitting on the fence. I think centrism is a stupid person's easiest way to come across as like sophisticated on an issue that they don't know anything about. Centrists love going, yeah, I think both sides are somewhat at fault on this issue. And that way they get to masturbate on their intellectual take without putting any thought, consideration, effort into the subject matter. Of course, centrism is basically siding with right-wing ideology if right-wing ideology is the dominant form. Hasan Reactions is one of the best ones in the React channel.